Today's daf in Masechet Shavuot is Lamed Zayin, right? I got that one. I always have some uncertainty. So yesterday we did the long Mishnah, which was Lamed Vav Amud Bet. So I'm not going to repeat the whole thing, half a daf, about Shvuat Pikadon, right? So we're going down the list of Shvuot. This is a very organized Masechta, right? We did last week Shvuat Eidut, and we've done Shvuat before that, Shvuat Bitoy, Shvuat Shav. We get to Shvuat Pikadon. Shvuat Pikadon is different because everything up till now has been referring to a Karban Olev Yored, right? Which is why we brought Tumah in the beginning, which has nothing to do with Shavuot, but has to do with Olev Yored. That there were several Karbanot you brought, including for Tumat Mikdash Kedoshav in the beginning of the Masechta, and now Shavuot. If you do it wrong, you bring a Karban. The Shvuat Pikadon is not a Karban Olev Yored, it's a Karban Asham, right? So meaning, if a person, which is different than a chatat and a levi oreid. So a person, Torah says, if they deny that they have something from somebody else, so someone gave you money to watch or gave you an object or you owe him money and you deny that you owe them money, then, and you swear falsely, you bring a karban asham, okay? Now, remember, the Shvuat Eidut is different, and we're going to discuss this all today, because Shvuat Eidut, it wasn't a personal responsibility. It was a secondary, you knew testimony that would lead to the guy getting money, and you didn't tell that testimony. You denied that testimony. Here, you personally owe money, and you deny that you owe it, and by swearing falsely, you prevent him from getting the money, right? So in some ways, it's very similar, because it's a cost to the other person, but of course, the difference is whether you directly owe it or you knew testimony about it. So that's where we were yesterday. Says the Gemara today at the Gemara, we're going to start two lines from the bottom of Lamed Vav Amud Bet. Rav Acha bar Huna and Rav Shmuel Brei de Rava bar Rav Huna. So these two people, and the third person, Rav Yitzchak Brei de Rav Yehuda, these three, I'll call them friends, were Tanu Shvuot Bei Rabba. They had gone for, the special seminar of Shavuot at Rabba's Beit Midrash. So Rabba, one summer, let's say, said, we're going to learn Shavuot. So anyone who wants to come and join us for Shavuot, and we'll have a comprehensive course about learning Masechet or Halachot of Shavuot. So they were there. Pagabu Rav Kahana. Now, one evening, Rav Kahana bumps into them. I don't really know the age difference in any of these people. But Rav Kahana says to them, Amar Lahu, top of Daf Lamed Zayin Amud Aleph, you guys are learning Shavuot now. You're big experts. I have a question that's been bothering me for some time. The question that he asked was, Hizid b'shvuat pikadon. Let's say a person lies on purpose about Shvuat Pikadon. Someone gives him, a watch to watch. I mean, it's not the best example. A diamond ring to watch. And he comes back the next day and he says, I'm sorry, it was stolen overnight. Turns out it's still in his kitchen cabinet. He lied. He's a shomer chinam. If it's stolen, he's patur. But in this case, he lied and he did it b'mezid, meaning, let's say he knows for sure that he didn't forget that he had it. He knows he has it. But usually, so that's clearly the case, where if he then swears that he doesn't have it, and he does, that he brings a karban. The question that Rav Kahana asked them was, what if he was hitrubo? What if witnesses came and gave him hatra'ah and said, look, there's a lotas in the Torah, don't lie, right? Don't swear falsely. It's probably the lotas. Either way, one of those two. And you're about to do this. We know that you have this, right? Or we don't know for sure, but you in case you do have it, and they give him hatra'ah, does he get makot? Mao. What's the halacha in that case? Do you say that given the chidushu, since this is an innovative halacha by Shvuat Pikadon, the bechol Torah lo ashkan mezid mighty carbon? We almost never. Now Rashi adds the almost. It's not never. There are very few examples, 4 actually, and this is one of them, where you bring a karban for doing something b'mezid, right? Usually you bring a karban for doing something b'shogeg. You forget it's Shabbos, you do something wrong, you bring a karban. By Shvuat Pikadon, you bring a karban even if you know for sure, even if you do it on purpose. Shvuat Eidut was another of the 4, we had it last week, right? Where even you know that, you also bring a karban, but it's a very rare thing. So usually you don't bring a karban for mezid. So maybe the Torah innovated, there was a chidush here, that usually you don't bring a karban. V'hacha, in the third line, mighty karban. Here by Shvuat Pikadon, even on purpose, or maybe only on purpose, you bring a karban. So maybe loshna atrube, loshna lo atrube. It doesn't matter whether you got hatra'ah or didn't get hatra'ah, that you don't get makot. Maybe that's what the Torah is saying. It's not that you bring a karban when you weren't warned, because you can't be punished if you're not warned. It's that when you do this, even b'mezid, the punishment is karban. Oh, Dilmer, perhaps. The whole point of the karban is hanimi leichad lo atrube. You bring a karban when you don't have hatra, meaning we never punish a person without warning them. So you weren't warned, but it turns out after the fact that you lied, and so that's where you bring a karban. But if you had proper hatra'ah, milka lucky, you would get makot and karban lamaiti. Maybe you wouldn't bring the karban. You would only get makot and not bring the karban. Dilmar, the third possibility is havaha vidna. Maybe you have to do both. Okay, so maybe you bring a karban and get makot. Usually you don't do both. You don't bring a karban and get makot, but that's because usually you get makot, or only you get makot or punishment if you do it with warning. Usually a karban is brought for shogeg, but maybe this is an exception. So maybe now you'll have a case where you did something, you did it on purpose. And the case here, remember, is Shevuot Pikadon. Someone gave you something to watch, or you owe something to somebody else, and you deny that you owe it to them on purpose. You know you're lying. You know you have this thing. It's in your pocket, right? And so the Torah says bring a karban asham. But maybe that's only if you didn't get warning that what you're doing is wrong, or that you're going to get makot. If you got a warning, perhaps the warning would make it that you do get makot, and either don't bring the karban, which is one option, or do bring the korban and get makot.
But excuse me, you bring the korban only once you have admitted that you lied.
Or person proves you lied, yeah.
Or somebody proves you lied.
Yeah.
Right.
You wake up the next morning and you say, okay, I feel really guilty about this. I want to go back, right? So you bring a korban, correct. Well, again, usually the case is no one knows you lied, right? That's the point. You know, but no one else knows, right? And so it's an interesting case because you could have, in theory, you could have asked the exact same question last week when we talked about Shevuot Edut, right? Shevuot Edut is in many ways, very similar to Shevuot Pikadon, because by Shevuot Edut, you also bring a korban for doing something on purpose, right? If you say, go into court and say, I swear I don't know testimony, and then the next day you wake up and you say, I'm really sorry, I lied, I felt really bad about it. You bring a korban for Levi Yored for Shevuot Edut, right? Remember, we said in the Mishnah before that if you forgot that you knew testimony, so you went into court and swore you didn't know it because you made a mistake, you wouldn't even bring a korban because you were totally shogeg, right? We call it, you didn't know, your onus, essentially. The case where you bring a korban is where you know you did it. So Tosfos points out here, and Rashi makes a comment similarly, that you can't conceive of doing hatra'ah, of warning someone that they know testimony, because in order to warn someone, you have to know for sure that they're doing the thing wrong, right? So you can know and say, look, I saw this morning you put this watch on in your pocket. I know you're lying. I know you have his watch, right? So by swearing you don't have the watch, we know you're lying. But how could you ever know somebody saw testimony, right? The only way you could know, I guess, is if you saw the testimony. But if you saw the testimony, you don't need their testimony, right? So by Shevuot Edut, you can't have a knowledge that someone else has something. They could have told you, but telling you is not testimony, right? If someone walks in and says, I saw testimony, you can't go to court and say, we know he saw it. He might not have been telling the truth, right? So anyways, that is the question that Rav Kahana asked these wonderful young yeshiva bachrim. We don't have any idea know if they were young, but these students who were studying at Rabba's yeshiva. So where are we now? So Amalei. So they answered him. We don't know which one answered him, but one of them answered Rav Kahana and said, well, we have a proof from a Braita. We've been studying Shavuot. We've learned all these Braitot. Tanina, we learned in a Braita the following. The Braita is comparing Shevuot Edut, remember, swearing that you don't know testimony, and Shevuot Pikadon, swearing that you don't have an object of a person. And the Braita says the following: Chamura himenu Shevuot Pikadon. Shevuot Pikadon is worse, is stricter than Shevuot Edut. Shechayavin al zdono makot, because if you do it on purpose, presumably with warning, you get makot. And al shigagato, if you do it by mistake, meaning you didn't get a warning, asham b'kesav shkalim, you bring an asham. It says when b'tikamer le'al zdono makot. Right, from the fact that we said that you get makot if you do it on purpose, michlal da'atrube. This language is not so fit well in the Gemara, but anyways, I'm going to read it. But some take it out because it really makes no sense. But anyways, it implies that you were warned. V'kamer makot in karban lo. So you prove from here that not only do you get makot if you do it on purpose with hatra'ah, but you don't even bring a karban. The karban's only brought when you weren't warned. So you prove two things from this Braita. And now my chumrah. Now, why is that so strict? Remember, if you did this in Shevuot Edut, you have to bring a karban. If you do it for Shevuot HaPikadon, then you get makot. Why is makot worse than karban? Why is getting lashes worse than paying an animal? Says Gemara, because people always appreciate paying money and not getting a personal punishment, right? It certainly seems better. My chumra, what's stricter? A person would always prefer to pay a fine or bring a karban and not get bashed, right? So that is a beautiful braita, and it explains the answer to his question, right? It says Gemara, well, not necessarily. Because Amaluhu Rava Bar Iti. Now Rava Bar Iti said to them, showed up from this, he's not one of the initial parties. Man Tana Zadon Shvuat Pigadon Unitin the Kapara Rabbi Shimon. Maybe, in fact, that's Rabbi Shimon's opinion. Now, we had opinion, which we're going to have more later, we had it before too, of Rabbi Shimon, that in fact, if you do a Shvuat Pikadon on purpose, you can't bring a karban. Meaning you can't get a kapara with a karban, right? Aval Rabbanan, karban ami mighty. But maybe that's only Rabbi Shimon's opinion. Maybe according to Rabbanan, you would still bring a karban. So this braita does not prove that to you. It does clearly prove in this braita that if you do a shvuata pikadon on purpose, you are warned, you get makot. So this answered part of Rav Kahana's question. Said Rav Kahana to them, I got news for you guys. Amalei Rav Kahana, bar mina dahi. Don't use that braita as an example. You know why? Because I'm the author of that braita, and you misquoted it, right? So you had the misfortune of telling over a quote to the person who said it and saying it wrong. Bar mina dahi, don't quote that braita. Da'anata ninala. I'm not the author, because Rav Kahana can't author a braita, but I'm the source, right? Rav Kahana can tell over a braita, and I learned it, and this is the tradition. I'm the one who taught it. And you want to know what I really said? I said, Echad Zdona v'Echad Shigagata Asham b'Kesef Shkalim. That both on purpose and by mistake, you bring in Asham. I didn't say anything about Makot. Someone later on might have thrown in that question of Makot, but it's totally invalid. So thanks for your answer, but don't prove to me from a braita that I know is incorrect. Now, if that's true, what do you mean that a karban of a swearing for a pikadon is stricter than a karban for swearing for edut? It's both a karban. So why is one stricter than the other? It's a karban olevi oreid if you're shvata edut. It's a karban asham if you're shvata pikadon. So if there's no makot, what do you mean it's stricter? My chumrah, what is stricter about it? It's stricter. Hatam chatat badanka. By olevi oreid, you can bring a karban that's worth a penny, not a penny, but say $5. Because it's olevi oreid, so you can have even a very cheap one, right? If you're poor. But hiacha asham b'kesef shkalim. By a shvuata pikadon, there's no cheaper or more expensive. Everyone has to bring the asham, and so therefore it's stricter because it's more expensive, but not because it's more than a karban. Ask the Gemara v'ligmar mina. Well, so why don't you prove from that braita that there is no makot? Now we could prove the opposite from Rav Kahana's braita, that since it doesn't mention makot by shvuata pikadon even on purpose, maybe there's never makot. Says, well, that's not a proof because dilma delatrube. Maybe that's where you didn't get hatra'ah, right? Remember, you only get punished with makot or anything if they warn you. Maybe you did it on purpose, but you weren't warned. So we don't have a proof. Okay, so lishnachri, now we got another version of this. We are, I don't know, around 20 lines down, middle of the line. Tashma, come and learn. Ein chayavin al shigigato, right? You are not chayav for doing this by mistake. Rashi says, I don't exactly know where the context of the braita is, but we'll see what it's talking about in a second. It's talking about shvuata pikadon. We know that. We don't know the braita. But you're not chayav, you do it by mistake. Meaning if someone lends you the gold ring or whatever, the ring, and you say, I don't have it because you forgot you had it, you're not chayav for making that shvuah. Mahin chayavin al zdona. Now, what do you chayav if you do it on purpose, where you do know where you have the ring and you lie about it? Asham b'kesef shkalim. You're chayav an asham that's worth 2 kesef. Now, what's the braita referring to? My labid atrube. Presumably, it's referring to every case, even if you got hatra'ah, and it's showing you that you don't get makot. So, that's not a proof. Maybe it's where they didn't warn you. So you can't prove anything from this braita. Tashma, okay, let's look at the next case. This is a case where we're comparing Shvu'ah to Nazir. It's this week's parsha, right? It says, Loam Amrit bin Nazir tamei shkin lokeh. Don't say, the context again is not so important, but we're comparing Shvu'ah to Nazir. Don't say by Nazir where if you do it if you're tamei by a Nazir, you get makot, right? If the person is a Nazir and he's about to walk into a cemetery and they say to him, don't go, and he goes, he's chayav makot for a lotase. So that's true about Nazir. Tomar b'shvat hapigadon she'en lokeh. You can't say the halacha, again, the basic halacha is not important here, but you can't say this by shvat hapigadon, where you swear falsely about an object where you never get makot. Now, obviously, mitakamar lokeh, In fact, you get makot by the Nazir, Michlal the Atrube. Clearly, they warned him, right? And it's a case of Hatra'ah. So you see by Shvat HaPikadon that you don't get makot avol carbon mighty, right? Now, my enolokes is what's sorry, that period. So this seems to prove that you don't ever get makot, even on purpose, even with Hatra'ah, by Shvat HaPikadon. Answers the Gemara, not necessarily, because maybe when it says enolokeh means eno niftar b'malkut. Maybe it means you don't get makot and walk out like you would do with any other avera in the Torah. Here, you got to get makot and bring a karban. So maybe the point of the Braita is that by Shvat HaPikadon, you also have to bring a karban, but it's not proven that you don't get makot. Says Gemara, well, if that's true, Michlal de Nazir Tamei niftar b'makot. What you're implying is that it's not like Nazir. Nazir gets makot only. Shvat HaPikadon also brings a karban. But karban k'tivbei. We learned in today's parsha, past day, right, on Shabbos today, that a Nazir who becomes Tamei has to bring a karban before they restart the Nazirut. That's when you're right, they bring a karban. But hatam the mighty karban kiechad the techel the Nazirut b'tahara. Right? They bring a karban in order to start the new Nazirut. It's not to forgive them for the sin they did. It's in preparation for the new Nazirut. You bring a karban. You end one and you start a new one. But the karban is not for kapara. Maybe by shua you do need a karban. So this was the question that Rav Kahana asked them, and they didn't come up with a solid answer. So the next day in the Beit Midrash, and again the Gemara doesn't say the next day, but in the future, Amru Rabbanan Kamei de Rabbah. Remember, they're all studying in Rabbah's Beit Midrash. So they came to Rabbah and they told him what happened. We bumped into Rav Kahana. He asked us this question. We brought this proof. He pushed it away. We brought this other proof. It didn't work out. Amar lahu. So Rabbah said to them, right? What Rav Kahana seems to be implying by asking you the question is that, let's say you had no hatra'ah, right? So there's a Shvat HaPikadon, right? Person lends you a watch. You swear the next day, I don't have your watch. The question Rav Kahana asked was, if they warn you and say, did you have the watch? And if you do, you're going to lie, you're going to get makot. Do you get makot or not? But the implication from this is that, where am I? That if they didn't warn you, right, you didn't get hatra'ah, but there are witnesses, so they know that you're lying. Meaning they see you wearing the watch, or they know the watch is in your chest, and they prove that, but you lie and you say, I don't have your watch, right? Which is a classic case, Shvat HaPikadon. Says Rabbah, that's actually a very controversial case, because think about it. The whole point of Shvat HaPikadon is that I'm denying I have your thing, and therefore I never give it back to you. But if two witnesses are going to testify that I have your thing, who cares if I deny it with my shvuah? Right? The fact that I denied it should have no impact, because you're going to collect it from me based on the two witnesses. You're going to bring two witnesses to court who say they saw the watch in my possession. I'm going to have to pay the watch. So the fact that I denied the shvuah should have very little impact financially, and therefore you should be patur. But it implies from here, let's read this inside, that lo atrube, if they didn't get hatra'ah, but ika edim, you would be mechayev. The person who swore they didn't have it would be chayev. Why? Kfirat dvarim ba'amahu. That's just denying words, meaning it doesn't have any monetary impact, because the monetary impact would be decided by the witnesses. The witnesses come and say, we have proof that he has your watch. He's got to pay your watch, right? From two witnesses. So the fact that I lied, I being the shomer, then doesn't have any meaning except that it's words, right? I lied. So you see from here that Alma Kasava Rabba, HaKofer b'mamon sheyesh elav edim patur, that if a person swears that they don't have money for someone else, but there are witnesses who know that he does, that swearing does not require him to bring a karban, because it's meaningless, because the witnesses are going to come and be mechayev him. So swearing did not empower or make the owner lose any money.
So what's the point of him actually denying that he has it when he knows that there are witnesses who are going to go against?
He might not know there are witnesses, or he might think they won't come, or it's true, but he might not necessarily know. It's not clear that he knows there are witnesses, but we know, or eventually we find out that there are witnesses after the fact, right? So remember, it's very similar to Shvat Eidut, where we said, you can lie about testimony, but if your testimony wouldn't have counted anyways, we don't care if you lie, right? If you're related, let's say. So that's the similar idea. This is Rabbah's opinion. Amalei Rabbi Chanina LeRabbah, says Rabbi Chanina to Rabbah, Tani de Masayelach. In fact, there's a Braita that supports you. Because the Braita says, V'kicheshba, remember this is a case where Olevi Ored, right? Where the Asham is. You deny you have it. Kichesh means you deny it. Prat, the model, echad min ha'achim, or echad min ha'shutfim. That's excluding a case where you admit to one of the brothers and one of the partners that you have it, but you deny to the other one. V'nishva al sheker, and you swear falsely. That refers to plot lelovet b'shtar. That excludes a person who borrows with a shtar, because there's a shtar. Like I can lie and say I didn't owe you money, but you have a mortgage. So who cares if I said I don't owe you money? You're holding a document that says I owe you money. That's what matters, right? Ulelovet be'edim, and someone who borrowed with witnesses. So if you borrow with witnesses, you see that you're lying and saying you don't owe it is meaningless. Amar le. Well, no. There, he said it's not a proof, because imishum halo tisayun. This would not be a proof, because it could be, but Omer, it could be a case where he said laviti v'lo laviti be'edim, where he actually said to the guy, I admit I borrowed money from you, but I don't admit that I borrowed from you with edim. Or laviti v'lo laviti b'shtar. I admit I borrowed it from you, but I didn't borrow with the shtar, in which case you would think you'd be chayav, because basically what he's denying, he's admitting to the principle, but he's denying that you have the proof, or that these people are able to basically just prove it. So sorry, in that case, he's admitting that he owes the money, right? And he's denying that he lent it with the shtar, which doesn't really matter at the end of the day, because he's going to pay the money. So maybe that's where the Torah says you don't have to bring a shvuah, because in essence, you're not denying anything financially. You're admitting that you owe the money. You're just denying the claims under which it's going to be paid. But if you truly deny it, maybe the pasuk would say you'd still be chayiv, even though there are witnesses. So it doesn't prove what Rabbah said, right? Remember, Rabbah said that if you deny it completely, but there are witnesses, then you don't have to bring a karban, right? This Braita might be talking about a case where you didn't actually deny it completely. You admitted you owed it, but you denied the circumstances of how you owed it. So that doesn't prove Rabbah's case. Now, how do you know that? Because the Braita says, the kicheshba, you denied you owed the money. The first example in the Braita was the model echad min achim leechad min hashutfim, right? You admitted to one brother or to one partner. Now, what does that mean? Hi leechad min achim echidami. What do you mean you admitted to one brother? If you said to the one brother, right, two brothers come to you and say you owe us $200, and you go to one of them and say, I admit I owe you 100. I deny what your brother claims, right? Then you're denying the other one. We're 10 lines in the bottom. Elav, it must be what you said. Damrile, mitirvayan yasvit. The two brothers came and said, you borrowed money from the two of us. We collectively lent you $200. Lamarlu, and he said to them, no. I owe $200, but I only owe it to Reuven, only me one of them. Lo michad minaychu yasvi, right? I only borrowed it from one of you. Now, and there, clearly, there's no monetary cost, because he's admitting he owes the $200 that they said he owes. So he's not denying anything, right? He's just discussing the formula of the claims, basically, who he owes it to. That is kfirat dvarim, and therefore it's no proof from the Reisha that the Sefer would be talking about a case where you actually denied you owed the money. It could be in the Sefer, the case is likely where you admit you owe the money, you just denied that there was a shtar, you denied that there were edim. But this doesn't prove yet what we say about Rabbah's case. Rabbah's case was you admit that you deny everything, You deny everything, but there are witnesses. So let's try to prove it from the next case. Tashma, these are the same braita we quoted earlier. We are 7 lines from the bottom. Einu chayav al shigagata. Now, you're not chayav for doing it by mistake. This was our Mishnah. Umau chayav al zduna. What do you chayav if you do this swearing falsely on purpose? Asham de kesef shkalim. Now, when it says zadon, what does zadon mean? My love, zadon edim. Maybe zadon means you denied it, but there were witnesses that know that you're lying. So you did it on purpose, and we know that because witnesses prove that you are lying. This is where not necessarily those that do not smoke. It could be where you admitted yourself, like Miriam's case, where you said, I admit that I was lying. So you owned up to doing it on purpose, but it doesn't tell you what happens if there are witnesses. Okay, Tashma, let's bring a case that we had last week. Hayushtei kitei edim. Right? Remember the case was you had two groups of witnesses. The Mishnah said last week that kafra rishona, achar kach kafra shniya, shteim chayavot. If the first pair say, we don't know testimony, and therefore you can't collect your money, and the second pair also say, we don't know, they swear, we don't know testimony, they're both chayav. And we asked last week, why, right? The Braita says, the edut could be true with either kat. Either kat could come and establish that Reuven owes Shimon $100. And we said last week, the second kat is critical because the first group already said we deny it. The second group are the only ones left, and if they deny it, you're not going to collect. But the Rishonah, my Mechayva, why is the first group Chayav, right? It's a case where basically it's only what's called, turn the page, it's only called Kfirat Dvarim Ba'alma, meaning there's no monetary impact of my lying. It's only words. Why is there no monetary impact? Because even though the first group lied and said we don't know about it, the second group is alive and well. And so he's going to have to pay it based on the second group. So this is equivalent to Rabba's case where you denied you owed money, but there's witnesses that say you do owe the money. So why don't you prove from there that you're chayav even in such a case? Answers the Gemara, Hakai Mashniya, question mark. Amar Ravina, top line of Daf Lamed Zayin Bet. Everyone remembers this, of course, from Shavuot, right? The case has to be where, in fact, there were not two groups of Eidim at the same time. There was one group that was kosher, one group that was puzzle. Remember, the second group was puzzle because they were related, because they were two men who were married to sisters. So when they're married to sisters, they are relatives. They can't testify together. But those sisters are deathly ill. They're on their deathbeds, right? And you might have thought, well, the first group understands that even though right now we're the only Eidim, pretty soon the second group is going to be kosher Eidim, and they'll be able to say it. The Mishnah is telling you that's false, right? That since at the time they were related, the first group denied it, they are really critical Eidim. So I'll read that inside. I'm Ravina. What's the case here? The second group of witnesses, at the time that the first group denied it, the second group were related through their wives, but their wives were deathly ill. You might have thought, well, since they're ill, they're going to likely die. And we do paskin that way. That it's true, but hashna miyat, right? Right now they're alive, and they're not dead. And so at this moment, the second group of witnesses are not false, they're krovim, they're relatives. The first group are the only people who can prove he owes the money, and when they deny it, they're costing him money. So that's why you pay. But again, we have not proven what we say about Rabba's case. So Tashma, okay, let's look at the next case, 5 lines from the top of Daf Lamed Zayin with that. Baal habayit sheta'an tanat ganav b'pikadon. Right, you have a balabait, which is always a term of someone who's watching a shomer. He says, someone gives him a item to watch, and he says it was stolen, and he's a shomer chinam, so he'd be putter. So he swears, v'nishba, and he swears that it was stolen. V'hoda, and then the next day he comes in and he admits and says, I'm really sorry, I lied, it's working on my conscience, I actually still have it, or I ate it, and I lied. Ubo edim, but then edim show up and say the same thing. So the question is, did he say it because of the Eidim or not, right? So he basically, now this is similar to Rabba's case, right? Because in this case, had he not lied or lied, it doesn't matter. The witnesses are going to show up tomorrow and say, he owes you a watch, right? So whether he lies about it or not, it has no implication. So now what does the Bright to say? If he admits that he owes it, that he lied before the witnesses show up, then he's like every other person who lies falsely, who always lie falsely, who swears falsely, and his mishalim keren is to pay the principal of the watch. The chomesh, you have to add a fifth, which is a fourth. The asham, and he has to bring a karban. That's the regular case of asham, of a lie, of a shvuata pikadon. But im mishabo edim hodeh. But if the witnesses show up and say he stole your watch, and he's like, oh yeah, by the way, I took it, right? Then his admission does not help after the fact. So then mishalim tashlumi kefel, you bring kefel, and you still bring an asham. Right? Now, what do you see from here? That at the time that he lied, there are witnesses. If at the time he lied, there are witnesses, then why should he ever bring a karban hasham? Right? It's kfirat dvarim ba'alma. He's only denying words. So what about the witnesses? This is the Gemara. You're right. I can easily answer like Ravina that there were not witnesses at the time he lied because witnesses were related and their wives were dying. And so at the time that he lied, the witnesses were not good witnesses. It was only after the fact that they became good witnesses. So at the moment he lied, there were no witnesses. I just want to point out that Tosa mentioned earlier, a few days ago, that remember these brothers, they're not brothers, these husbands, these men, sorry, who are witnesses, they also couldn't be related when they became witnesses. So it has to be a case where they saw the testimony, they then married the sisters are now deathly ill, and they're going to then die. Because you have to be kosher when you see the testimony and when you give the testimony. You don't have to be kosher all the way through, right? So at the moment they saw it, they couldn't have been related. The moment they reported in Beit Din, they can't be related. They could be related in between.
Why do they both have to be married to sisters? Why can't one just have married the other's sister?
How could one? Because then I think. Let me just think about it for a second. That if the sister dies, you might still be related. I think if it's not through marriage, then it doesn't end with death.
But if it's a pair, both of them have to be kosher. If one of the two is not kosher, then it invalidates the testimony.
No, but James' question is, let's say the sister then dies, so you're no longer related to the brother-in-law. But I think in that case, if it's a sister, if it's not through marriage, you would still be related.
It is through marriage, though. I don't understand. Your sister's husband, your sister dies, then you're no longer related.
Right. So let me get back to you. I don't recall. I think that's the case, that they would still be possible, but I don't know for sure.
Not enough. Can I just curious?
No, I understand, but it's important. The Gemara felt the case; it has to say it. So that's the case. So that's Ravina. So now we don't have an answer. We are 10 or 11 lines on the top. Amrle Ravina the Ravashi said Ravina to Ravashi. This is much later, of course, than Rabbah. Tashma. Let me bring a proof to you from the Braita, and we quoted this Braita again on Amud Aleph. Chamura mimenu shvata pikadon. Shvata pikadon is more strict than this. Remember, the case was shvata edut. Shechayavin al zdono makot or shegato Hashem bekesef shkalim. That you're chayav if you do it on purpose makot, and if you do it on shogeg, you're chayav in Hashem. Now, remember, we said that Rav Kahana earlier today said this is a mistaken Braita, and we're going to, of course, say that in a few minutes. But for now, we have this Braita. So now let's read it. Mitika amar lokeh. From the fact that it says you get makot, mechladika edim. Obviously, you can't get makot unless you have proof that you did it wrong. And there are edim, but it says that you bring it by mistake. If you did it by mistake, you bring in Hashem. So you see that this Braita clearly says that if you make a shvuat hapikadon on purpose, you get makot. By mistake, you bring a karban, even though there are clearly witnesses. So even though there are witnesses, and your shvuah really is not impactful because they would have just brought the witnesses and made you pay, you still bring a karban. And Amrlu Rav Mordechai said back to them, well, that's a bad Braita. Bar mina dahi, don't quote this Braita. Damlu Rav Kahana, because Rav Kahana a few generations ago, I don't remember how many, but a few, said, Anatanina, I'm the author of the Braita, Tanina La, Vahachi Tanina, and in fact, the correct way to read the Braita is Echad Zdona, Echad Shigigata, Hashem Bekesef Shkalim. That there's no makot, so therefore there doesn't have to be edim, right? You bring a asham. Tashma, okay, let's bring the next Braita. Again, these are all Braita we had earlier. Lo imamar bin nazir tamei. That might be true by nazir tamei shekin lokeh. You get makot. Tomer b'shvata pikadon she'ena lokeh. Don't say it by shvata pikadon where you don't get makot. Now again, echidami. What's the case? Idaleka edim. If there are no witnesses that saw you do the thing wrong, amai lokeh. Then there's no makot if you don't have witnesses. Elapshita must be the ika edim. We're talking about a case where there are witnesses that have established that what you did was wrong, or that you stole the money, or that you became tamei. Vikatani tomar b'shvata pikadon she'ena lokeh. It says by shvata pikadon you don't get makot. Milko dulalak yav karban mighty. It implies you don't get makot, but you would bring a karban. And so this definitively proves that, in fact, even though there are witnesses that saw you steal this thing, and by you denying that you have it, will ultimately have no impact, because the witnesses, you'll deny it. The guy will then find the witnesses. They'll come to court and they'll say that you have to pay it. And therefore, still in that case, you bring a karban. And this tiyufta, the Rabbah tiyufta, in fact, this goes against Rabbah, and Rabbah's wrong. The Braita clearly proves that, in fact, even if you just do kfirat dvarim, you only denying words, meaning you didn't actually cause any monetary loss, you still bring a karban. And Rabbi Yochanan, Amar Rabbi Yochanan, in fact, says, I disagree with Rabbah, hakofer b'mamon sheyesh lav edim chayav. If you deny that you owe money, even if there are witnesses that will prove that you do, so your denial didn't have a big impact, you're chayav a karban. But if there's a shtar, you're patur. But if there's a document that says you owe the money and you deny, and they don't have the document obviously in front of them, but you deny and say, I don't owe money, and then they produce a document that you don't bring a karban. Amar of Papa, my time into Rabbi Yochanan. What's the reason for Rabbi Yochanan? Because edim avidi demaiti. Witnesses, especially in a place where the mafia is rich, right? They have a way of dying, right? The witnesses can disappear, right? So having witnesses is not always the case. You're going to get your money. If the witnesses don't show up, they die, then you're not going to get your money. And so by denying that you owe the money, you might have a big impact, even though ultimately there are witnesses. But shtar, hamanachle. But what happens to a shtar? Shtar is a document. It's not going anywhere. And so if the shtar proves that I owe money, then me denying that I owe that money doesn't have any real impact. I'm like, Huna Braid of Yeshua of Papa. You never heard of a shtar disappearing? Shtar and Ham Yavad Demirchas. A shtar can walk away also. It's been known to happen. It can get ruined, it can get ruined, it can get lost. The bank can burn down, right? They could go out of business. So you might not have a shtar. El Amar Afuna B'Rei B'Shua, that's not the reason. Hayin time of Rabbi Yochanan, the reason for Rabbi Yochanan is Mishram Da'avi Shtar Shibud Karkaot. Now remember, if you give money with a shtar, if you lend money with a shtar, your property becomes mishubat to that loan. If Ruvain lends $100 to Shimon and writes it in a shtar, then if Ruvain later sells his house, whoever buys the house will have to pay Shimon back if Ruvain doesn't pay them back, right? And ein miviin karbanon kfirut shibud karkaot. And we're going to see from Sukkim later, actually, that you never bring a karban if you deny that you owe land. Right? If a person comes to you and says, you have my land, and I say, I swear I don't have it, even though it's a lie, and even though it's proven to be a lie, you never bring a karban when karkaot are involved. So every document automatically converts a loan basically into a piece of property. Itmar, now in fact, there's a statement in the Gemara that discusses this. Mashbia edei karka. Let's say you ask witnesses about land to swear and they lie, and they say, we don't know it, right? So you have two witnesses and you say to them, I want you to swear that I've lived on this land for the last 5 years. Remember, that's a chazakah, right? And they say, we don't know what you're talking about. And then it's found out that they're lying. They do know what he's talking about. So pligi bar Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Lazar. Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Lazar, his colleague, argued about this. Chanamar chayav, chanamar patur. And we say, Tistaim, it seems logical to Rabbi Yochanan, Damar Patur. Rabbi Yochanan is the one who said you'd be Patur, as we just quoted him. Damar Rabbi Yochanan, hakofer b'mamon sheyesh lav eidim chayav. If you deny that you owe money, even though there are witnesses, you're chayav, but shtar Patur. And so that's what we just explained. Kid Rav Huna B'Rei Yeshua who explained it, Tistaim, and that's actually a really good proof. So in fact, this is Rabbi Yochanan's opinion, which seems to be the way we paskin, that if you deny you owe money that is going to be proven to be owed by witnesses, you're still chayav a karban, because those witnesses are not as reliable as you think. But if you deny you owe money that is backed by a shtar, then you don't have to bring a karban because it basically becomes karka, becomes land, and you don't swear about land. We're at the first of the intermediate wide lines. Amle Rabbi Yirmiyah bar Rabbi Avo, said Rabbi Yirmiyah to Rabbi Avo, Lema Rabbi Yochanan and Rabbi Lazar, who have this argument about lying about land, is beplukted Rabbi Lazar, Rabbanan Kamifki. They're arguing about the machloket that Rabbi Eliezer, the Tana, and Rabbanan had the Tanya. It should be the Tanya. There's a brighter that says the following: Hagozel sadeh mechavero. A person steals a field from their friend. I walk into, not me, someone goes into someone else's field, starts plowing it and planting it, and puts up a sign and says, "This is my garden," right? And the other person says, "Get out of my land." He says, "I own it." Brings him to court. But before he has a chance to have the case and pay him, Shatfa Nahar, what's called Hurricane Katrina comes by, right? You get a flood, and the water and the field is ruined. And now the guy says, "What? I don't want this field back. I want a different field," right? So says the Braita, Chayav lahamed lo sadeh. You stole a field. If you can prove you stole it, you got to give back a field. This field is ruined, so give him a different field. Different Rebbe Eliezer. The Chachamim Omrim, that's ridiculous. Omerlo, just say to them, I'm really sorry I took your field. You can have it back now, right? Here it is, even though it's ruined. So the question is, that's a Braita. Amrina, now when we discussed this Braita in Bava Kama, we said b'maika miflagi. What's the machloket? Rabbi Eliezer darish ribuya miyute. Rabbi Eliezer darshans the Torah in the style that we've had a lot of times of riboy and miyut. Riboy and miyut is very expansive. We include everything and exclude a few things. And Rabbanan darshi klali prati. They darshan with klal and prat, where you have general principles and exclusions, but it's more limiting. And therefore, let's read the psukim now. Rabbi Eliezer darshi ribuya miyute. Pasuk says, the pasuk we've been quoting today, Ki chesh ba'amito, you deny you owe something for your friend, riba, that includes everything. You deny you know anything, right? But then it says bepikadon, which is a specific thing that was lent to you. Oh, but somet yad, or a loan, mi'et, that excludes things. And then it says, oh, mikol asher yishtava, the sheker, right? Anything you swear about. So that's chazar v'riba, that goes back, it includes everything. And the principle is riba, mi'ut, or riba. You have a general, a particular, and a general. Then riba kol, you include everything, so that anything you swear about, you should be chayav. Anything you steal, you're chayav for. My riba kol mili. My mi'et shtarot. We only exclude one thing, which is a shtar. If you lie about, you steal a document, then you're patur. And the reason for that is because the document itself has no intrinsic value. Right? The document leads to value. It's davar gorem lamamon, but there's no value in the shtar except for maybe pennies. But we'll talk about that. But the shtar itself says, "I owe you $1,000." It's not worth $1,000, but it leads to that. So that's where if you lie about a shtar, you don't bring a karban. But everything else, you're mechayiv a karban. and including land. Rabbanan darshi klal u'prat. Rabbanan use the same sukkim, they darshan them in klal u'prat. Kichesh mamito is the klal. Pikadon b'tzomad yad o begezel is prat. Omikol asher shavar lav l'sheker chazar v'klal. Klal prat u'klal yatadan el ke'ena prat. Ma prat mufurash davar mitaltel gufo mamon. Just like everything that's described, the lending, the money, the gezel, and the loan, these are all things that you can carry, you can hand over on like a field, and they are of intrinsic money, unlike a shtar, right? Afkol davar metaltel v'gufo mamon. Yatsu karkaot excludes a field, she'ein metaltel, you can't carry a field. And yatsu avadim, and we also exclude slaves because they're hukshul karkaot, they're like considered to be like property. And yatsu shtarot shafal b'shem metaltelin, even though you can actually carry a shtar that says I owe you $1 million, ein gufan mamon. It's not mamon. So man de mechayev kreb Eliezer. If you're mechayev for stealing karka, for mashpia ede karka, sorry, then that's like Rebbe Eliezer, or you'd be chayev for stealing land. And man de patar would say to you, where my man chayev kreb Eliezer, man de patar karabanan, would go like the Rabbanan. Says, well, that's not necessarily the case because the cases are somewhat different. Amar lei, so he said back to him, not necessarily the same thing because look, where am I? Lo man de mechayev kreb Eliezer. Look, Amar lei, sorry. Where am I? Man de karabanan. I'm only low. That's not correct. Man de mechayev kreb Eliezer. Certainly, if you hold that you can make a shvua on, you can deny a shvua on karka and mechayev a karban, you have to hold like Rebbe Eliezer that you can steal karka. Right? Because according to the Rabbanan, you can't steal karka, right? So you can't be mechayev a shvua on it. So certainly you have to hold like Rebbe Eliezer. But man de patar, but the one who says you're patar would say, I can even go according to Rebbe Eliezer. Amar lecha b'ha, afil Rebbe Eliezer moda, d'rachmana amar mikol v'lo hakol. The pasuk says, if you swear from everything and it's excluding that shvua is different than payment. Payment, I'd have to make for any karka. But shvua excludes karka, so it's not necessarily the same thing. And Amar Rav Papa, we're 6 lines from the bottom, we're almost done. I know it's a long, long daf. Says Rav Papa, Mishmei de Rava, Matnita Namideka. In fact, our Mishnah supports very much this statement that you're putter if you swear on karka, because it says Ganafta et Shori. The case is I swear that I didn't steal your shor. V'hu Amar lo ganafti, he says I didn't steal it. Meshbiacha ani v'amar amen chayev. Right? If you swear, you're chayev. Now, we only said a case of shor. Remember, we frequently say a case of eved. You stole my eved, which people, of course, steal as well. But we didn't say that. Ilu ganafta avdi lo katani. My time, alab mishum to eved itgish the karkaot. It must be that we specifically didn't want to say eved, because eved is like karka, and I'm avian carbon al kvirat shibud karkaot. You don't bring a carbon al kvirat shibud karkaot. But, says Rav Papi, Mishmei de Rava, that's not a proof at all. Because Ema Seifa, look at the end of the Mishnah. It says, Zaklal, Kol Mishalim Api Atzmo Chayev, Shein Mishalim Api Atzmo Patur. This is the rule. If you have to pay it by your own admission, you're chayev. Sorry, the opposite, right? If you're paying on your own admission, you're chayev. If you don't pay on your own admission, you're patur. So Zaklal Atuyemai. Why did we have to give a rule? Remember, rules always include something. My love, like tuyek enough to davdi. Maybe the klal actually is being marred with the case where you said, if I stole an eved, that you bring a shvuah, you have to make a shvuah if you deny it. It says more on the top of Lamed Chet, Elameha Leka Lamashma Mina. In fact, our Mishnah is not conclusive. The first part of the Mishnah implies only a shor and not an eved. The second part of the Mishnah is marbe, more things, and therefore we can't prove one way or the other. So we don't have a proof from our Mishnah, but that's Rabbi Yochanan's opinion, that if you lie and swear falsely about something in which there are witnesses, you bring a karban. If it's something in which there's a shtar, you don't bring a karban because the shtar turns into land, and once it's land, you're putter from a shvuah. We will stop there. Sorry, I know it's a tough daf to do on this late Saturday night, but shvuah does not get easier, so sorry. And tomorrow morning, we will pick it up, God willing, at 7:45 a.m. on Zoom. Miriam, what are you doing?
Thank you.
They decided that they want to have like an end of program Zoom tomorrow. So
Well,
I know.
Oh, wow.
It's the program that never ends. Every week it's like we're doing this.
We will miss you. Unfortunately, I'm away next Shabbat, so I'm going to record, God willing, ahead of time. I'm going to try to do it either tomorrow or Wednesday, so hopefully long ahead of Friday.
Great. Thank you.
Congratulations, Miriam.
Yes, congrats again.
Thanks. Shavuot Tov.
Shavuot
Shavuot
Tov.
Tov. Yasher Koach.